to get in there. So, I mean, stand up and say no. I really hope a lot of particularly STEM departments stand up and say no to this nonsense, because it's ultimately going to have some bad things happen to STEM. It's ultimately going to have some bad things happen to STEM, so far as I can see it. Alrighty, I'm back again. This piece caught my eye. And, I end up talking a lot about higher ed, because higher ed is where the next generation of scientists are trained. And it's where a lot of young scientists work as postdocs and research fellows and, young assistant professors and things like that. And so it becomes important to understand what's happening at a university, what does it mean, and what might the impact be on science. Because my concern always at the university is, if it's not about the pursuit of the truth, and if it's not about having diverse viewpoints represented and discussions, you end up with ideological conformity, and therefore you only ever approach one thing from a particular worldview, and that affects things in science too. This caught my attention because it discusses a thing that I've had a concern with for a long time, the DEI statement, diversity, equity, inclusion statement. Longtime viewers of this channel know that I'm not a fan, and I think of them very much as ideological litmus tests. But also, quite simply, there is no evidence anywhere. I have yet to see it come from the literature that having a DEI statement does anything with respect to the goals of a DEI program, what goals that exist, or at least the ones that they claim to be. And so that's what I wanted to get into, but not this article entirely. I don't want to read this in its entirety, because there's other things I want to talk about that are related to it and show a point that I want to make about the DEI statements themselves. And we shall get into that momentarily. First off, if you haven't had a chance yet, of course, the Real Journal Club podcast is now available. Gina and I are having all sorts of fun. We're already planning what the next episode is going to be. I'm going to record that here soon, and that'll come up in June. So this is probably going to be a monthly podcast, so you'll see a new episode appear in June. But we're very much looking forward to it. We very much enjoyed it. I've received some feedback already, and I'm glad you all are enjoying it. Those of you who've given feedback. It's, again, available here on Spotify and Amazon Music. But by the way, if you prefer Google Podcasts, it's available there too. So you can go check it out in a bunch of different places. I'm working to get it up on Apple Podcasts. That one's being a pain in the ass. But I will do my best to get it up there too. But of course, you can always listen on RSS. And after it comes out on audio, I'm going to try and have the video version out on the channel. So you can find it on the YouTube channel if you prefer to listen on YouTube and see our lovely faces at the same time. Back to the topic at hand, though. So what he's talking about here is, in the 1950s, with a lot of concern over communism and the Cold War and what have you, there was a whole thing of having loyalty oaths for job positions at universities in the United States, where you were going to be you had to swear fealty and that you weren't a communist. And when we think about it from the standpoint of free speech and viewpoint diversity, those were themselves problematic. They were wrong to have, if we're thinking about it from the past now. Even as much as I dislike communism immensely, that still wasn't the right thing to do, was to have a loyalty oath around communism. So let's see. It is rare to meet someone with true moral courage who risks... Good grief, I've got to get an ad blocker. His story, set during the Red Scare of the 1950s, needs to be told because it applies today, when political zealots again demand rigid conformity. George, a boy from rural Illinois, refused to bow down to the most powerful lawyers in his home state. He knew their demands were strong. Even though he could have easily and truthfully said yes to their substance, he refused, solely because he thought them asking violated basic guarantees in the U.S. Constitution. So, let's see. The time was the early 1950s, and the demands from the ideological crusaders on the right, who insisted on anti-communist loyalty oaths. Today's crusaders come from the left, demanding pledges of support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. More on today's ideological frenzy in a moment, but first, George's story. So let's see. So after World War II, George moved to the big city in the University of Chicago, where he earned an undergraduate degree and a law degree, top of his class, in 1951. He passed the bar exam and had only one more step before pursuing his chosen profession. Like all applicants, he had to answer a few questions from the Illinois State Bar Association. The examination began with some standard questions about communism. Those should have been easy, since George abhorred Marxism. Still, George's answers focused on civil liberties were not what the Bar Association wanted to hear. First, he noted that dissent and even revolution were integral features of America's constitutional history. Then, the hapless members asked George the big question: are you now or have you ever been? George and Anastopoulos refused to answer. He could have truthfully said no, end of story. He could have noted that his parents' homeland was fighting a brutal civil war to prevent communists from seizing control. He could have done all that, but he refused. His threefold reply was that the Constitution guaranteed freedom of association, that it was not illegal to belong to the Communist Party, and most importantly, it was totally improper for the Illinois Bar Association to ask him that question, or any question about an applicant's political affiliation. His application to practice law was promptly denied. So that was the 1950s. And that was the Red Scare. Folks were terrified of communism, and we did a lot of things that we shouldn't have at the time. In that, shouldn't be judging someone based on their political affiliation. That's pretty much what it is. On that, should not be denying someone that particular a position or something based on the political affiliation. So George and the Illinois Bar Association then did what all good American attorneys do. They sued each other. The constitutional challenge, in which George represented himself, took a full decade to reach the Supreme Court. It was the only case George ever argued, and he lost it despite a powerful dissent from Justice Hugo Black. Too many men, quote, too many men are driven to become government-fearing and time-serving because the government is permitted to strike out at those who are fearless enough to think as they please and say what they think, Justice Black wrote. This trend must be halted if we are to keep faith with the founders of our nation and pass on to future generations of Americans the great heritage of freedom which they sacrificed so much to leave us. George also receives strong support from Leo Strauss, the great political philosopher and seminal figure of conservative thought. He congratulated George for his brave and just action, and added if the American bench and bar have any sense of shame, they must come to their knees and apologize to you. Of course, they never did. George was never admitted to the bar. Instead, he taught political philosophy for 6 decades and wrote multiple books on political thought and civil liberties, eventually teaching at Loyola University's law school. He was also our neighborhood Socrates, walking the streets of Hyde Park near the University of Chicago into his mid-80s, meeting friends and engaging in the kind of rigorous conversations recounted in Plato's dialogues. Why does George Anastopoulos' moral courage matter for us today? Because we are enduring another age of ideological zealotry, coupled with demands to sign or resign, or never be hired in the first place. So this is where they get into it. So here's the thing with I don't necessarily agree that DEI statements are equivalent to the anti-communist oaths, mostly because it's not quite the same ideological thing, and I will make the note of point here that in some places these are not as firmly entrenched as others. And I'm going to make a point in that in a second. I'm going to make a point on that in a second, as to why. Let's see. Today's clearest analogy to anti-communist oaths are the demanding adherence to statements of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The crucial point here is not the specific content of DEI statements. You might agree or disagree with them. The crucial point is that it is improper to make these demands for political conformity. In that sentence, I entirely agree. It is utterly improper to make a demand for conformity on a viewpoint, for scientists in particular, conformity on a viewpoint that has nothing to do with what your day-to-day work is. If you're a researcher in physics, no, it is not proper at all to demand political conformity to a viewpoint on DEI. Same thing for climate scientists, a hydrologist, an ecologist, all the way down the line to every physical scientist and social scientist and what have you. If it has nothing to do with what you do in your day-to-day work, you should not be denied a job or losing a job because of those demands for political conformity. Now, yes, most thing is it is an at-will work state, which means you can be fired at any time for any reason in the United States for a lot of things. So for a lot of, you can be fired for any reason and no reason at all. And some of these things, in some businesses and companies and what have you, but doesn't make it right to be fired or not be hired for a job at all because you don't hold to a particular worldview. Let's see. Such demands are unfortunately commonplace in university campuses, so are the bureaucracies that enforce them. Those demands and those bureaucracies are antithetical to the basic mission of the university, where freedom of expression and diversity of viewpoint should be core values vigorously protected. Instead, every university has its burgeoning DEI bureaucracy, which writes these statements, runs seminars to indoctrinate students, staff, and faculty, and punishes the recalcitrant. Many departments won't even consider hiring someone who refuses to kneel in obedience. So they get into something here, and I'll come back to the article in a bit here, because they bring up Berkeley's example for search committees when they're hiring. Their rubric for assessing diversity, equity, inclusion. So I decided, you know what? We're going to have a look at that, but we're also going to look up more. See how many more I can find on a quick search and take about 10 minutes really searching for them. You'd be surprised how many I found in 10 minutes and where they come from. First things first. And this is not just Berkeley. This is also suggested for Caltech and things like that, because actually one of the original links I found was also for Caltech. Rubric for assessing candidate contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion. This is about hiring here and hiring anywhere. So, so the DEIB, and it's not just DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. You want to make people feel belong, you don't make them feel like their values can't be expressed anywhere, or you're going to select people out because they don't share them. Anyway, sample rubric envisions the evaluation of DEIB as encompassing three main areas: knowledge and understanding, section 1, track record of activities to date, section 2, and plans for contributing at Berkeley. Committees may wish to adjust this categorization to reflect their particular needs. Or goals. Okay. DEI rubric. How is it scored? Search committees have found it very helpful to assign numerical scores to each section of the DEIB rubric. It's helpful in identifying and analyzing specific areas of agreement or disagreement as the committee discusses each candidate. Remember, these are faculty jobs that we're talking about, where you should be, protecting viewpoint diversity. Let's see. How should the rubric assists committees in scoring each of the three areas? Okay. How can committees make sure to best make sure use of the DEIB evaluation rubric? We strongly suggest conducting a calibration exercise in advance of reviewing the entire candidate pool. The purpose of a calibration exercise is to be able to apply the tool equitably, consistently, and reliably across all applicants. How can search committees calibrate their scoring? Discuss as a committee the importance and evaluation of contribution to DEIB as one aspect of excellence. Equity and excellence don't fit together. They're opposites. As a reminder, at least equity in the social justice sense. If you're talking about equity in the actual sense of what it was supposed to be, the equality of opportunity, then yeah, they can go together. But if you're talking about equity as equality of outcomes in the social justice variety of it, no, they don't go anywhere near together. Equity consumes excellence, as it were. Adapt the rubric for use for a particular search. Select a random sample of 8 to 10, redacted for candidate name. Apply the rubric to the statements. Okay. So, let's see. Little to no evidence of awareness of DEIB issues in higher education. Little expressed knowledge of or experience with dimensions of diversity that result from different identities. This is the stupid thing where they think your different race or what have you defines the identity. Defines diversity only in terms of different areas of study or different nationalities, but doesn't discuss gender, ethnicity, or race. Discusses diversity in vague terms, such as diversity is important for science. In other words, if you said what I just said, that viewpoint diversity is important for science, I'd be flunked on this rubric. Good grief. Little demonstrated awareness, has some knowledge, clear knowledge of experience with and interest in dimensions of diversity that result from This understanding can result from personal experiences as well as investment in learning about experiences of those with identities different than their own. How about an identity different than their own? This is a break down the self kind of thing, where you go with the multiple identities. I'm sorry, I have one identity. Thank you very much. I have one identity. I don't have multiple identities. Stop it. It's really incredibly dehumanizing to me to hear this multiple identities thing. No, I'm sorry. I have one identity. My individual self. Thank you very much. It's aware of demographic data. Okay, let's see. Track record in advancing. Participated in no specific activities or only one or two limited activities. Only mentions activities that are already our expectation of faculty as evidence of commitment or involvement. In other words, they want you to be doing more than what your current university requires. Descriptions of activity are brief, vague, or nominal or peripheral. I was on the committee of diversity last year. So in other words, if you're kind of focused on your work. Plans for advancing. So vague statements are bad about what they would do at Berkeley if hired. May even feel doing so would be the responsibility of someone else. In other words, if you don't view it as your purpose to do this advocacy stuff they're asking you to do, because as a scientist, you may very well hold the belief that it is not the job of the scientist to engage in advocacy at all. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, that's a problem. Then you wouldn't be able to get a job with the Berkeley. Explicitly states the intention to ignore the... Here you go. If you're going to treat everyone as an individual, you would not be hired at UC Berkeley. And probably in most of the UC system, to be honest. This is probably applicable to the UC system. If that's what they... But wait. There's more. University of Washington. Their human resources section. Oh. Ha! Looks like I can't get in there to see it. It's behind a wall. But wait, there is more. Brandeis University. Little express knowledge or experience with... they draw this from. Designed by the University of California system. So that rubric I just showed you from UC Berkeley is getting passed around and used everywhere that they want a diversity statement. So as it starts in California with some of this lunacy, it comes to other areas here. So this is pretty much the same thing, right? And so again, like I said, states they would be happy to help out, but seems to expect the university or department to invite or assign them to activities. In other words, if you don't volunteer to do this, or we're not going to hire you. In other words, you have to embrace their worldview, is what I get out of this. And then, no, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable in the slightest. It is not acceptable in the slightest. This does not promote viewpoint diversity. Oh yeah, where's this? Emory. This is Emory College. Don't you love this particular phrasing for this? Please note, this rubric is not meant to be a prescriptive tool. Emory College, problematic approaches. These are problematic approaches, according to Emory College. Now, this one's a bit unique. This one actually doesn't look a lot like the Berkeley one. The Berkeley one's been used in a few places, but solely focuses on how their teaching, research, and or service could theoretically address DEI, but the ideas are not entirely novel, feasible, practical, or impactful. Solely focuses on their belonging to an underrepresented group. As evidence, they completely understand... I didn't notice that one before. Solely focuses on their belonging to an underrepresented group as evidence they completely understand the barriers other individuals could face in the academy. That right there is a way to weed out anybody who is part of one of their underrepresented groups but doesn't want to do the DEI stuff. That is a weed out right there. Woo! Discusses how they are knowledgeable of DEI through passive participation in a few works. Solely provides anecdotes of how they've been discriminated against or have discriminated against someone as evidence they value and understand. So those are the problematic ones. So if you do that, you score 0, right? How they will create without a clear actionable items. Yeah. Okay. Briefly mentions. Passively describes past participation in workshops and what have you, has little time invested in advancing DEI beyond basic expectations for the academic rank, has given little to no effort to increasing their knowledge or understanding of DEI-related topics, simply discusses DEI in vague terms, but does not describe how they would work to improve DEI in their lab, classroom, university community. So in other words, if you're not being an active and you're not doing this, we don't want you there. You don't embrace our worldview. They don't want you there. That's pretty much what it comes out as. Let's continue. Oh, by the way, for those of you who thought the middle of the country was safe from this nonsense, this is the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, I believe, the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Candidates in the faculty of the Institute of Agricultural and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Now, this is why I say DEI statements are not fully strong in here everywhere, because those other rubrics are really, really thick, and they identify specific things like saying that you're actually going to focus on treating everybody the same and institute procedures to do so, rather than go with the crazy thing of I got to treat everybody differently because of whatever race they are, or sex they are, or gender, or whatever. But this one is different because it's much more vaguely so. And so it says to me that they haven't done a whole lot necessarily here. Either that or they're trying to simplify it down. Nevertheless, it's there, Nebraska. Let's see. I was looking. Oh, yes. This one, Department of Biological Sciences Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. This is Texas Tech University. As you can't see it up here, but I will link it in the description for you, and you can go have a look for yourself. But this is Texas Tech University. If you ever thought that those Reds, that some states were not in trouble with this kind of thing, you find it. You can find it. Vague statements about what here it is. Texas Tech, if hired, may even feel doing so. You might notice some of the language is similar. They're borrowing it from that Caltech place, from Berkeley rather. So it's not unheard of that it would be borrowed from a few places. But I just wanted to make the point that these all exist, and that was in a few minutes that I found these rubrics for faculty hiring from multiple universities across the country. And it's really, really astonishing and really, really sad because, you're selecting people for viewpoints on something that has nothing to do with their day-to-day work. Has nothing to do with their ability to advance the science, has nothing to do with it in the slightest. And it's political advocacy kind of thing. And in the case of one of them, it looks like they're cutting out anybody who thinks differently in some very sneaky, nasty ways. With that one, I think it was the Emory College one here. Some very sneaky, nasty ways to just cut people out of it. So, this is kind of concerning in a lot of ways. And I want to point something out, because this statement from this particular blog post from Heterodox Academy from last summer is actually very, very accurate in that there is no evidence to support that any of this works to actually make things better at a university. There's absolutely no evidence to support it. Um, and that's just like, what the hell, man? But I keep pointing this out because it's just like, I can see it happening, and it is my fear on a lot of in a lot of levels that a lot of young scientists who don't agree with this worldview and will not embrace this will get they will get they'll leave. Brilliant people who we could use for a lot of who could really do amazing things in science will end up either leaving or getting thrown out because of the desire to have people who are not problematic in the social justice sense. Um, and that's going to be really, really detrimental to science going down the road because you need viewpoint diversity. You need diverse worldviews and perspectives to help you have different methods for approaching a problem and creatively approach a question, and answering a question with analysis and what have you. That the minute you start selecting for viewpoints, the minute you start taking away a lot of the ability to get at the truth, and it really stunts the growth and the progress that science could make when you do that. So he concludes here with this kind of things. And yeah, imagine if you study quantum physics, organic chemistry, statistics, artificial intelligence, you pledge your allegiance to an ideological statement far removed from your field of academic excellence. Until now, the university had been requiring DEI statements on a voluntary basis. Yeah, sure. Imagine refusing and trying to get hired. He would fight the good fight all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary, where today's justices might listen more closely to Hugo Black's powerful dissent. The entire course of George Anastopoulos' life, as disclosed by the record, has been one of devotion and service to his country first, in his willingness to defend its security at the risk of his own life in a time of war, and later in his willingness to defend its freedoms at the risk of his professional career in time of peace. The one and only time in which he has come into conflict with the government is when he refused to answer questions put to him by the committee about his beliefs and associations. And I think the record clearly shows that the conflict resulted not from any fear on Anastopoulos' part to divulge his own political activities, but from a sincere and, in my judgment, correct conviction that the preservation of this country's freedom depends upon our adherence to our Bill of Rights. We need a lot more people like George Anastopoulos, and a lot fewer people like Andreas Ken Gilaris and his heavy-handed cadre of DEI enforcers. We need a lot more people with George Anastopoulos' integrity in public and private universities, in K through 12 schools, and in private businesses and nonprofits. His courage and his reverence for America's Constitution are an enduring model. So let's see. This was written by Charles Lipson, who's professor of political science emeritus, University of Chicago. Down here. So I think y'all know where I stand on this. That DEI statements are a mess, and I mean, selecting for viewpoint selecting for viewpoint on something that has nothing to do with your academic field of excellence really should not matter at all. Your views on that issue should not be the basis by which you are selected for a job. And frankly, if that's the way you're selecting, you're narrowing the pool and getting rid and making it impossible for a lot of brilliant minds to get in there. So, I mean, stand up and say no. I really hope a lot of particularly STEM departments stand up and say no to this nonsense, because it's ultimately going to have some bad things happen to STEM. It's ultimately going to have some bad things happen to STEM, so far as I can see it. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good lovely jazz. And of course, come on over to Locals. We'll be talking some interesting things over there soon. But that's it for now. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, my friends.